Good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from today, and thanks for attending today's webinar on Azure Governance. Before we get started with the content of today's session, there are just a few housekeeping items that I'd like to go over with you. If you take a look over on the left-hand side of your webinar console, you'll see a Q&A window. We have a few technical experts here today with us who would be happy to answer any questions you have at any point throughout this presentation. We will also reserve the last 10 to 15 minutes of this presentation to answer any questions that haven't been answered just through the chat functionality. If you now look over on the right-hand side, you'll see a list of resources. We've provided a couple of URLs we think you might find helpful throughout this presentation, so you can feel free to click on those whenever you like. Finally, below that, you will see a survey box. So once we're finished with today's presentation, we'd really appreciate any feedback on how you think we did today and any subject areas you are interested in learning more about, as this will really help us determine the sort of webinars we will be putting out in the future. Lastly, we often get the question, will the slides be available from today's presentation? And the answer is unfortunately no, we are not able to send out the slides, but you will be getting an MP4 and an on-demand link sent to you of today's presentation, and you should be getting that by email within 48 hours, so keep an eye out for that. We have one presenter joining us today, and it is Alex Frankel, who is a program manager for Azure Governance at Microsoft. So Alex, whenever you are ready, I'd like to hand it off to you.
Thanks, Nick. So when you think about the traditional approach to the cloud, you historically have had to sacrifice speed in favor of control. In order to make sure that resources and environments were being deployed correctly, the cloud custodians became the group responsible for provisioning all the resources that would be consumed and then hand over access to those already deployed resources. But this process was time-consuming and involved a lot of steps and a lot of people. But with smart governance, what we're going to talk about today, you can enable velocity through native controls. So you get the best of both worlds, both speed and control. When it comes to cloud management platforms and brokers, we're approaching this differently. We're integrating governance natively directly into the cloud, rather than a shim between the cloud and the customer. So I want to take a step back and ask what it means to govern in the cloud. What is the goal as a cloud architect when you're no longer the gatekeeper for resources? And what you're really trying to do is make sure that the right people are deploying the right resources with the right configurations. But how do you do that? How do you set up governance in the right way so that this happens? That's exactly what we're going to talk about today. So a quick agenda for today, we're going to start by covering governance basics. So we're going to cover things like scopes and the hierarchy options that you have in an Azure tenant. We're going to cover role-based access control, so you can restrict what users can do what operations. We're going to talk about Azure Policy, which is a service that restricts what resources can be deployed and how those resources should be configured. And we're going to talk about Azure Resource Manager templates, which is a way of codifying what the resources should look like when they're deployed. The second section we're going to cover is governance strategy. So once we understand the primitives of how you govern an Azure environment, how do you get all of that deployed? How do you structure your subscriptions and your resources to ensure that governance happens in the right way? And we're going to talk about Blueprints, which is a service that helps you scale out your Azure environments very quickly. The last section that we're going to cover is around tracking governance. So once you've configured governance in your Azure tenant, how do you make sure that it's actually doing what it's supposed to? There we're going to talk about policy compliance, the data that the policy generates, activity log, as well as a service called Resource Graph, which helps you query your Azure environment and ask questions about how your environment is behaving. So let's start with the governance basics, starting with something called scopes. And scopes are the levels of hierarchy that form an Azure environment. So at the lowest level, you have something called a resource group. which is simply a container for your resources. And your resources are things like virtual networks and SQL databases and virtual machines. And many resource groups sit within a subscription. By default, in your Azure tenant, you have one subscription, but subscriptions have limitations for how many resources and resource groups can be deployed there. So you may hit limits associated with the subscription and need to create new subscriptions. As you continue to scale out your environment and really start to take advantage of Azure, you're going to start to have a lot of subscriptions. So we have a new construct called a management group, which is an additional level of your hierarchy that allows you to group subscriptions together, and that helps you administer controls at a higher level instead of having to repeat them across subscriptions. And you can actually create a hierarchy of management groups up to 6 levels deep. And so you can map out your organizational structure inside of your management groups. The next governance primitive that we'll talk about is role-based access control, or RBAC. And this restricts what users can do in an environment. So what we're looking at here is a role assignment object. And this is something that you'll see a lot in the portal for managing access. And your key pieces here are the principal. This is the user. In this case, the user is myself. But this could also be a group in Active Directory or an app that has been given API access. And the second piece is the role. And this restricts the type of actions that a user can do. As an example, an owner can really do anything in a given scope, but a reader can only look at resources but not modify them. And this is what a role definition looks like in Azure. And the key thing here is the action section. And this is where you list the actions that a given role can perform. So in this case, we're looking at a variety of actions. Some relate to the storage resource type, or the networking resource type, or the compute resource type, and the individual actions are listed right next to it. So in this example, I can read anything from storage and read anything from network, and I can do more actions for compute that are listed here. Some key RBAC info that we want to cover. The main point is that RBAC restricts who can perform what operations on which resources. And RBAC assignments are inherited to all children of the assigned scope. And what that means is if you assign an RBAC role to a subscription, it will be inherited down by default to any of the resource groups within that subscription. An RBAC assignment can be applied to all levels of your hierarchy and all scope types. And you can actually make custom role definitions to change the operations that a given role can perform. And lots of organizations make these custom roles. The next governance primitive we're going to talk about is a service called Azure Policy. And Azure Policy allows you to do real-time enforcement, compliance assessment, and remediation of non-compliant resources, all at scale. Some key info about policy. The first is that no other platform, no other cloud can do real-time policy enforcement. So no matter if resources are being deployed through the API or through ARM templates or through the portal, it will always be enforced by these policies. The policies scans, they generate compliance events that can be used for monitoring and alerting. These policies can also be used to automatically remediate problems in your environment. So if policy finds that a resource is non-compliant, it can be configured to actually correct those non-compliant resources. And just like RBAC, policies can be assigned to management group, subscription, or resource group. And also just like RBAC, they're automatically inherited down your hierarchy to all children of the assigned scope. So the best way to walk through policy is to actually demo it. So I'm going to switch over to the browser. So now I'm in the Azure portal in the policy service. And what I'm looking at here are a list of policy definitions. And these are the policy rules that we'll be evaluating when you deploy a resource to Azure. So let's walk through and create a new policy definition. The policy definitions themselves are saved wherever you'd like in your hierarchy at a management group or subscription. So I have a lot of management groups here. I will pick this particular management group that happens to be called Azure Policy and select that. The policy definitions themselves get a name, so I'll just call this Azure Webinar Policy. And I'll scroll down to the actual policy rule. And this is what defines what the policy is going to look for and what the policy rule will do if it finds a violation. And it's constructed as an if-then statement. So starting at the top with the if statement of the policy rule, this particular policy rule is describing that it's going to look at the location of where the resource is being deployed, and it's going to look through a set of parameters of allowed locations. So essentially what this policy is saying is if the resource being deployed is not in the list of allowed locations, then it's a policy violation. And if it's a policy violation, then it looks to the then statement for what it's going to do. And what it looks at is this effect, which by default is set to audit. Today we'll be talking about audit policies as well as deny policies. An audit policy will simply flag the resource as non-compliant and create a non-compliant event that you can look at in the policy compliance section of the portal. But it won't block any resources from being created. A deny, on the other hand, will do all the same things, except it won't let the resource be deployed. It will actually stop that resource from being created. So I'm going to switch over to a different tab here, where I'm going to attempt to create a virtual machine and use a configuration that is not allowed. So you can see what your developer experience would be like if you hit a policy violation. So the important information here, I have my virtual machine name and the region where I'm going to deploy it. And the key here is the VM SKU size that I'm going to use. So this is a D-series VM, and the series relates to the performance of the virtual machine. And I'm going to click this button called Review and Create. And when I click Review and Create, the portal is going to check to see that this virtual machine is configured appropriately and check it against all the policies that exist at this particular resource group. So this particular one failed, and we can actually look and see why this virtual machine failed. And in the error details, I can see that this particular resource was disallowed by policy. And I can actually see what is the policy that prevented me from creating it. And there's a policy here that says allowed VM SKUs, and I'm only allowed to deploy A and B series VMs. So because it's a D series VM, I know that I would have to go back and change this to either an A and B series VM if I wanted this VM to be successfully deployed. And then the last thing I want to demonstrate around policy is the compliance view. So once you have all these policies deployed, they will actually return compliance information. So I can see here I have a variety of policy assignments. And for each given policy assignment, I actually get a compliance percentage. And this tells me for the resources that are covered by this policy, only 3% of them are compliant. And we also roll up an aggregated count across all your resources that you have access to, what is the overall resource compliance. So that's the basics of policy. And we'll cover some best practices for rolling out policy in your environment. So to start out, you're going to want to use audit policies, which is a safe way of understanding what a policy will do without affecting user activity. So you can understand where non-compliant events will be triggered, where those non-compliant resources will be found. When you are ready to use deny policies, use staged rollouts to understand what the impact is going to be. So start by rolling out that deny policy at a resource group or a pre-prod subscription before you decide to make that deny policy a company-wide or org-wide or management group-wide policy. Once your policies are laid out, understand the apps and teams that are non-compliant, so you can understand who's being affected by the policies that you've laid down. And then if you are going to automatically remediate with policy, you're going to want to roll out those remediation jobs in stages. So you understand the impact of each remediation and you don't ruin a large set of resources by accident. The last governance primitive that we're going to talk about are Azure Resource Manager templates. And this is how you model your infrastructure as code. Some key info about ARM templates. It allows you to codify your resources and their properties, which makes it an effective way to standardize how resources should be deployed in Azure. So you can give your app teams and app developers a set of approved templates to know that your resources are being deployed in the right way. And of course, these templates will take into account the policies and the RBAC restrictions of where these resources will be deployed. The templates themselves can be applied to a resource group or a subscription. For most of your resource deployments, you'll be targeting a resource group. So those are things like virtual machines, SQL databases, and networks. But you can also deploy an ARM template at a subscription. And this is where you can create policy definitions or assign policies or create RBAC roles or assign those RBAC roles, all with ARM templates, all as code. Some best practices for using ARM templates in your organization. You're going to want to start to develop a repo of custom ARM templates to help app teams onboard to Azure using the right resources and the right properties. You'll want to keep your templates as modular as possible for maximum reuse. And this just follows good engineering practice. You want to make sure that these templates do a specific job and do that job well. And you want to piece those templates together to help you set up an environment. You want to treat this just like any other code that you manage. So you want to test it and you're going to want to version it. And don't test in a vacuum. So don't test these templates simply against a clean blank subscription. You want to test them against the policies and the RBAC controls that will be applied when these are used in production. The second section that we're going to cover is governance strategy. So we understand the primitives of how you do governance, but how do you actually implement them in your Azure tenant? So we'll start by talking about resource group strategy. Resource groups are easy to create and delete. So you should feel free, especially early on, to experiment a little bit here to figure out a strategy that works best for your organization. The key takeaway to understand is that these resource groups give you an opportunity to apply a governance control. So apply an RBAC or policy assignment. Some organizations will break up these resource groups by environment type, so tests and prod and pre-prod. But the recommended best practice is to break these resource groups apart by workload. So you keep all your networking infrastructure together in a resource group, and all your front-end infrastructure together in a resource group, and all your back-end infrastructure together in a resource group. And what this allows you to do is have RBAC and policy controls that relate to that workload. So you'll have a bunch of policies that relate to networking and what can and can't be done with networking, and who has access to those networking resources. The same is true for your front-end and your back-end resources. The next section that we want to talk about is how you model your subscriptions. So we know that we're going to create many subscriptions if we're using Azure at scale, and we're going to talk about now a strategy for doing so effectively. So as I said before, subscriptions have different quota limits for different resource types, and we'll be providing you documentation on those quotas. What that means is at a certain level of usage, you will need to create new subscriptions to scale out. So you'll need to have a strategy for doing so. What we've seen is that this is a really crucial workflow that can actually slow down a lot of organizations who are not ready to scale out their subscriptions. Some questions that you'll need to answer as part of this subscription modeling is who will be responsible for creating subscriptions? Will that be the application teams themselves? Will that be the cloud architects? And what resources will be in a subscription by default when it's created? What policies will be there? What RBAC assignments will be there? What resources will be there? So when you think about your strategy for subscription modeling, you have to think about what defines an app in your organization in Azure. Typically, that's a production and a pre-production environment. And the Microsoft recommended best practice here is to dedicate an entire subscription to production, an entire subscription to pre-production. And what this allows you to do is add governance controls that relate specifically to production and relate specifically to pre-production. So you can add RBAC and policy that's just focused on production, and RBAC and policy that's just focused on pre-production. Now, how do you then take these subscriptions and nest them into your management group hierarchy? While this may seem a little strange at first, I hope that it's going to make sense in a second. What we recommend you do here is actually break apart your production and pre-production environments into separate management groups. And again, and this is a theme, the idea here is that it allows you to group your governance controls in a coherent way. So all of your RBAC and policy that relates to production can be applied to one management group, and all of your policy and RBAC that relates to pre-production can be applied to the pre-production management group. And as you continue to scale up your use of Azure and deploy more applications, you will continue to use this strategy. So you'll end up with a management group with a set of production environments and a management group with a set of pre-production environments. The last thing you'll need in each of these management groups is a subscription dedicated to shared services. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to as a hub subscription. And this is for central assets like a key vault, or monitoring and management tools like log analytics, or ExpressRoute for networking to on-prem resources. And you'll want to dedicate a subscription in each of these management groups for these shared services, one for production and one for pre-production. The management groups themselves will be nested under an organizational-wide management group. Depending on the size and the scale of your Azure usage, you may have a few of these org-level MGs, each with a structure similar to what we're looking at here. It just depends on the size and scale of your organization. Now, depending on your Azure strategy, there are other alternatives that we've seen customers implement. One of the common ones is dedicating a subscription to an entire application. And that means production and pre-production are both contained within the same subscription. Now, again, there's nothing wrong with doing this, but as you scale out, you may find that there's not enough quota limit for your production environment or your pre-production environment, so you may set yourself up for some pain further down the road where you have to separate out these two environments into separate subscriptions. The same goes with what we've seen customers do, sharing applications within a subscription. So you may actually have a shared subscription with many applications, but again, the risks here are similar, that if app A, for example, becomes a much larger workload than you were expecting, you would have to go through the pain of getting that application out of that subscription. So we'll cover some management group best practices. You'll want to define your hierarchy based on organization and environment type, like we just discussed. The root management group, which is created by default when you set up management groups, is where you can do global configuration. So for example, if you wanted a global networking policy to always close down port 80 so it doesn't have inbound access, you could set up that policy at the root management group. As I said before, the management groups can be nested up to 6 levels deep, and your subscriptions can actually be a child of any management group in your hierarchy. So the subscriptions don't only need to exist at the lowest level of your hierarchy, they could exist under any management group within those 6 levels. And lastly, be careful with management group level assignments, as they will cascade through large chunks of your hierarchy. Now, we've talked about all the different governance primitives that help you set up governance and environment. We've talked about the strategy for rolling out subscriptions and how subscriptions should be organized in a management group. And now we're going to talk about a service called Azure Blueprints, which helps you package, deploy, and update these cloud environments in a repeatable manner using composable artifacts. Some key info on Blueprints. As I said, a blueprint allows you to package a variety of artifacts together for easy deployment, versioning, and management of those environments. And those artifacts are all the things that we've been talking about up to this point. So artifacts include policies and RBAC assignments and ARM templates and resource groups. The blueprints themselves are saved at a management group and assigned to subscriptions. Those blueprints can be assigned to the same subscription more than once. So if you are sharing an environment and you want to set up a similar environment in the same subscription, you can do that with a blueprint. And lastly, you can lock blueprint managed resources, so even subscription owners cannot modify it. So if you have a virtual network that's specific to a subscription, but you don't want subscription owners to modify it, you can lock that by packaging it in a blueprint. So as with policy, the best way to show blueprints is through a demo. So I'll switch back over to the Azure portal. So here I'm on the Getting Started page for blueprints, which walks through the basics of how you create a blueprint and how you assign a blueprint to a subscription. So what we'll do is create a very simple blueprint so we can understand how artifacts get added to a blueprint. So we'll click Create Blueprint, and we have to fill out some basic information, like what is our blueprint name, call this Azure Webinar Blueprint, and the location for the blueprint definition. So just like policies, we have to tell Azure where we want this blueprint definition to exist, and those must be saved at a management group. So I will save it in this management group that happens to be called Azure Blueprint, and select that. Once I filled out the basics, I can move on to artifacts. And the artifacts is where we add all those different governance controls to our blueprint definition. So we'll click Add Artifact and add an artifact at the subscription. We'll choose our artifact type, and these are the artifact types that we've been talking about. So I have policy assignments here, role assignments, and resource groups. So I'll click a policy assignment. And these are all the policies that I have access to in my Azure tenant. So I'll choose this policy that audits VMs that don't use managed disks. So this isn't going to block anybody from creating VMs, but it will alert me if anybody is violating this policy. The second artifact I'm going to add is a role assignment. And again, the first thing I must choose is the role. I'll choose contributor, which is a role that gives me a good amount of access for creating resources. I could keep this parameterized and fill this out when I deploy the blueprint, but I'll fill this out right now. And I will add myself. And now I have an RBAC assignment artifact also packaged in my blueprint definition. I'll add a resource group. And within the resource group, I can add those same artifacts. So I can actually click Add Artifact within the resource group and have the same list of controls. I have policy and role assignment. And because I'm in the context of a resource group, I can actually add an Azure Resource Manager template, which we covered. So I'll add something simple here, like a storage account. And I'll grab an ARM template that I've already developed. And I can see here, this is just a simple ARM template. It's deploying some resources. The resource is a storage account, and I've configured the storage SKU and the location of that storage account, and I'll click Add. And now I have a basic blueprint definition where all the different artifacts that we've been talking about can be added to the blueprint definition. And I've broken things apart by resource group. Obviously, this can become a lot more complicated with more resource groups and more artifacts and more controls. So I'll save this draft, and what I'll do is show a more complex, more complete blueprint here. And we can see here it's the same idea, but it's just a bit more expanded. I have some more policies to restrict locations and require tags. I have more RBAC roles, and then I have a bunch of different management or resource groups here to help me organize where resources should exist, and I have different access given to these resources. So in the case of networking, I have a virtual network that's going to get created, and only my networking team has access to these particular resources. When a blueprint gets applied to a subscription, it becomes an assigned blueprint. So we can look at what an assigned blueprint looks like here. This is the same blueprint definition that we were just looking at, but applied to a subscription. And we can see here all these resources have been created. So I have my policies and my resource groups. I have my networking and my key vault. And I've actually locked all these resources down so nobody can touch them but the blueprint. So that's blueprints. Stop sharing my screen and switch back to the presentation. So the last section that we're going to cover is tracking governance. So we've gone through and figured out what are the governance primitives and governance controls we're going to use. We figured out a strategy for setting up our hierarchy and deploying those governance controls throughout my tenant. And this last section is about understanding how well governance is being implemented in my environment. So the first thing you want to understand is activity log. It's a really good first step for diagnostics and troubleshooting and some basic monitoring. Pretty much all resources write events to the activity log, so you can see the types of events that have been taking place in a given subscription or given environment. It's a useful tool for alerting for specific events, so you can configure alerts on activity logs, so you could be monitoring for delete events or resources being created where they should not be created, and you can set up alerts for that. And you can actually route these activity log events to other locations. So it's very easy to integrate with Azure Log Analytics, which is an Azure service, or you can route them to an Azure storage account and do further analysis and move them to other external tools. The next thing you'll want to take advantage of is policy compliance. We walked through this a little bit in our policy demo. And again, this is where I can view the compliance data that has been generated by the policy scans that have been taking place. And I can actually slice this up to be looking at policy compliance by an individual policy, by initiative, which is a set of policies, or by scope, so I can see for a given subscription or a given management group, how compliant am I? We automatically provide a compliance percentage for each assignment, which helps you assess your environment quickly. And finally, those compliance events are routed to activity log, which we just saw, and you can use that to set up alerts on your compliance info. The last thing I'm going to talk about is Azure Resource Graph. This is a service that you can use to assess the state of resources in your environment by doing ad hoc querying. So you might ask a question like, how many VMs in my environment are not using managed disk? And you can ask questions about all the different resource types and all the different resource properties that are in Azure. It works at any scale. So regardless of the size of your environment, the Azure Resource Graph will run very, very quickly and return most queries in just a few seconds. Now, when you just start out in Azure, Resource Graph may not be something that you need right away, but as you continue to scale up and have more and more resources, Azure Resource Graph is going to become a really critical tool for understanding what's happening in your environment. And you can actually turn your Resource Graph queries into policy definitions. So if you've been doing some ad hoc querying to understand what your environment looks like and you find a problem, you can run a command to turn that into a policy definition, which is really, really helpful. So that's all that I have for Azure Governance and getting started with Azure Governance. I have a few pieces of documentation here that you'll find helpful. The first is information about those subscription quotas. And the second is a pointer to all the governance documentation, which is all listed together. So documentation for policy, resource graph, and blueprints you can all find in one spot. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Nick. Thank you, everybody, for your time today.
All right, great. Thanks, Alex, so much for that great presentation. So it looks like we are now just reaching the end of our 60-minute time limit here for today's webinar. So we are going to bring this session to a close in just a few minutes. But before we do that, it looks like we've had some really great questions come in. So we're just going to spend the next 10 to 15 minutes going through those questions and answering as many as we can just through the chat functionality today. Also, as mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, we would really appreciate your feedback on how you enjoyed today's presentation and any topics you were interested in learning more about in upcoming webinars. This will really help us determine the sort of webinars we will be putting out in the future. You will also be sent an on-demand link to today's webinar by email within 48 hours, so keep an eye out for that. So again, the Q&A window is open. Feel free to pop in your questions, and we will get to as many as we can. And I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. Have a great day.